they were rather disgruntled about it. And when they got to Quebec City, they found that the government wasn't going to take them any farther. So they had to spend more of their money getting to Lachine, where there were rapids. And of course, everything had to stop at Lachine. But when they got there, the soldiers were waiting to be settled in Richmond, which of course is in Goulbourn Township. They were veterans of the War of 1812 from the 99th Regiment, many of whom were Irish. And so as the Talbot settlers mingled with the Irish soldiers, the leaders, of course, of the soldiers suggested that a number of them simply join the soldiers and go to Goulbourn, which was a trip up the Ottawa River to Ottawa from Montreal. And a number of families, 17 families, agreed that they would do this. The rest of the families, there were 44 families altogether, all ended up in London Township, but that's another story. So our group came and settled in Goulbourn, and they were settled with the military settlers. The people, Colonel Burke, who was in charge of the land grants, settled many of these families in the 12th concession of Goulbourn, which is where Hazeldean is, and of course now Canada is. And the reason why this is sort of interesting for our family is that it was really family ties that brought us here. Many of these people from Ireland were related, and the Young family was a part of an extended family, which was the Culbert family. John Culbert had a daughter, Sarah, married to Robert Young, but 3 or actually 4 other daughters. One of them, Susan, was married to William Hodgins. And all of this family group was all settled side by side in Goulbourn in Hazeldean. Now, after they had, of course, settled and went through the settlement duties and all that they had to do, of course, families started to grow. And of course, there were a number of children born. Robert and Sarah Culbert Young had 8 children. 3 sons and 5 daughters. The first son was John. The second son was Robert Jr., and the third was William, who is my ancestor. The names of the daughters are Deborah, Marianne, Sarah, Susan, and Ellen Jane. But what was happening, of course, by the late 1840s is there wasn't very much land left for this next generation of people to buy or to move to. The good land had pretty much taken up, but they were opening new land, a new settlement in Russell Township. So Robert Jr. was one of the first people to come and settle in Russell Township. And it's sort of an interesting story because he was married December 13th, 1849 to Sarah Lawler in the cathedral, which wasn't the cathedral then, but in Christchurch, Ottawa, or Bytown. 6 weeks later, they bought their farm in Russell. They bought 2 pieces of land in Lot 15, concession 2. One piece was bought for, was 100 acres and bought for 50 pounds from Richard Mara or Morrow, and the other was 50 acres bought for 50 pounds from James Mara or Morrow. And so that's the farm that many of you associate with the Young family, where the Moffats, of course, lived. When we look at the original documents, the witnesses to these sales were Robert Young Sr. and William Hodgins. Again, William Hodgins was married to Susan Culbert, so a brother-in-law, and an uncle to Robert Young Jr. And why I mention him is because he was a very important figure, and his name comes up over and over again if you look at stories of settlement, because he owned so much land, and frankly, he was a speculator. By 1853, he owned over 4,000 acres. Wow. Now you can move forward, please. Oh, yeah, this is the old church in Hazeldean, which was, interestingly enough, I've been asked a number of times how I found the Youngs. Well, it was two ways. One is that my great aunt had a little piece of paper where she'd written the names of Elvira and Mabel McCaffrey, and wrote on it that they were the daughters of Thomas Colbert Young. But when I went to the diocesan archives, I saw that there had been some baptisms held in Hazeldean. One was Thomas Colbert Young, 1852, then John Young, 1853, and George Wellington Young, 1856. But funnily enough, their parents they lived in Russell. So it appeared that the Russell Youngs would go home to Hazeldean to have their children baptized. And two of these baptisms actually took place at Christmas. So you can imagine that they journeyed, which wouldn't be an easy trip, all the way from Russell to Hazeldean to spend Christmas with their relatives and having the children baptized. Because of that, I was able to figure out that there must be Youngs in Russell, and I picked up the phone book and I saw a name there, which was George Young. There he is. So I called George, and he was wonderful and wanted to see me and invited me over to Russell, and basically showed me everything there was to see. And I went to the registry office and looked at the original documents, and he was very, very kind. And he introduced me to his sister Muriel and her husband Sandy Moffat. Interestingly enough, my father's sister is also called Muriel. And I noticed that seems to be a tradition of the same names in the family. Next slide, please. There's Muriel and Sandy, who again were wonderfully kind. Muriel wrote to me a number of times, and I can't say enough good things about these people. Next, please. This is a stone in St. Mary's Cemetery for Robert Young Jr. and Mrs. Sarah Young, of course, who was Sarah Lawler. You can see that he died in 1897 and she died in 1900. If you go to look at this stone, what's interesting about it is that all the other sides of it are covered with names of various members of the family, some of whom lived in Russell and some of whom went west and lived there and died there, but they managed to keep the name and post it on the tombstone in Russell. Next slide.
Excuse me, Roger. I'm just going to ask Judy and Scott if you could please mute your microphone, please. Judy, we're able to hear you doing your dishes, so it's quite distracting. So please mute.
I didn't know I was on.
Go ahead, Roger.
Okay, just going back to the story of Tipperary and Clough-Jordan. You can see there's on this map that there's Boris O'Kane and Clough-Jordan are not very far apart, and they are near Loch Derg. I have been there twice, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that later on. So that's where we came from. Next. And this is the original, you might say, document that was submitted to the Colonial Office by Richard Talbot with the names of all the settlers he wanted to bring with him to Canada. And on this the ones that are interesting to us are John Colbert, farmer, 50, his wife Anne, and their children Anne, Mary, and Francis. And they later, of course, married into other settler families. And then William Colbert, who is his brother, and who was also came to Hazeldean, Robert Young and his wife Sarah Colbert, and their son John, who was born in Ireland and came as an infant, and then his other daughter Susan, who was married to William Hodgins. As I mentioned earlier, William is the man who was the land speculator and quite a, we might say, mover and shaker in the early Ottawa Valley. Next, please. This is Hazeldean in 1863. I don't know how well you can see the details of this, but the names of some of the original settlers are on this map. Obviously, R. Young is there. And where you see John Hodgins, that was the land that had belonged to William Hodgins, his father. You'll also see John Young and a number of the other names that are familiar to us in Hazeldean, the Grants and the Bradleys and the Butlers and the Abbotts. So this is essentially the world that Robert Young Jr. lived in before he traveled all the way over to Russell and started a new branch of the family over there. This is the old Hazeldean Cemetery, where these original settlers who came on the Brunswick are buried, along with many of the other original families. And this is where Robert Young and his wife Sarah are buried, and so many of those other founding families. We're hoping to have a plaque put up in this cemetery sometime soon to commemorate this journey of the Talbot settlers from Ireland. This is the tombstone. You can't really read it, but so you know it's there, of John Colbert and his wife Ann Dowell. And I put this here because these are our ancestors. Anybody named Colbert, this is what you might say, if Robert Young is my third great grandfather, this is my fourth. So this is John Colbert, and then going next. This is the tombstone, gravestone of Sarah Colbert and Robert Young. She died in 1868, and he died in 1877, aged 86, which was an amazingly good age. These stones are actually, many of them are mounted in a wall in the cemetery. They long ago fell down, and the cemetery had sort of revived them by mounting them in a permanent spot. This is the map, of course, of Russell Township. This is from the 1879 Belden Atlas. You can see, of course, that Duncanville has Russell Post Office. Eventually, Duncanville became Russell. And you will also see over on the left the Forest Road, which is that sort of squiggly road that goes north and south. And at the top of that road, where it ends, is where the Young family lived. And this is, now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about these pictures, because the story behind these is that, as some of you will know, the old farm, the farmhouse that had belonged to Thomas Young, which is still there on the Forest Road, was lived in by his uncle Edgar. And George, of course, lived across the road where Sue does now. And after Edgar had gone to the nursing home in Embrun, George took me into the house, and we entered a room that nobody had been in for decades, I think. And there were, in a glass case and on the walls, a whole bunch of family pictures, and many of them were identified. So George kindly allowed me to bring them home and have them photographed and preserved. So this is Robert Young Jr. This is the ancestor of all the Youngs in Russell. This is his wife, Sarah Lawler. I can't say that I know a great deal about the Lawler family. I've been asked a few times. I've never done any work on the Lawlers. I think there were other Lawler families who were settling in the Russell area at the time. So I hope that some of you maybe know a little bit more about them than I do. This is William Hodgins' tombstone. And I put this here just because, first of all, it's such a grand stone, and also because William has been, so instrumental in so many areas of the Young family life, because it was, as I said, through William that Robert Jr. ended up in Russell, because I'm 99% sure that William, we might say, what helped him financially to buy his land, his uncle William. This is the old Young house. So some of you may have seen this. It's the same picture that was at the beginning with the horse and buggy. This is the same building. Now, I think this burned and was replaced a couple of times. There is another house there in that location, which is where, anyway. Now, this is, of course, the house that Edgar had lived in, which was his parents' house, the home of Thomas C. Young, and it was called La Grange, or the Grange. And you can see this picture shows all the buildings as well. A familiar sight, but of course, now next picture here. This is I'm going to talk about the family of Robert and Sarah. This is their first son, whose name was William Robert. Each of the three sons of Robert Young had a son named William Robert. And my own great-grandfather's name was also William Robert. This was one of the earliest stones in the cemetery at St. Mary's, and this lad died at the age of 18. These pictures are all from the old house. Thomas Colbert Young, as you can see his dates, and his wife, Emily Jane McNally. This is Thomas Colbert Young's first wife. They're all buried in St. Mary's Cemetery. Her stone is there too. And frankly, he was married twice, because this is his first wife, who died in childbirth and was buried there. And then, of course, he remarried. Many of the stories of our early family are full of stories of things like that, you know, children's passing and childbirth and all those kinds of things. So this is Maggie McNabb. And some of you will probably know some of these local names from Russell. This is another son, John Young, who was born in 1854. He was also baptized in Hazeldean, and then his family, daughter Lorna and son Robert. Okay. Now this gentleman is the next son, and what's interesting about him is that this grave is not in Russell. This grave is in Hazeldean, and he married Susanna J. Hodgins, who you see there, who is a granddaughter of William Hodgins. And they were second cousins. But of course, in those days, that wasn't such an unusual thing. So he seems to have had a lot of connection with the Hazeldean Hodgins family, his wife's family. Now, on the side of this stone is two daughters, Ina and Mildred, and their deaths. There's also a son named Reggie on the other side of the stone. And why I put this here, next slide, is that this was one of the pictures that was found in the home in Russell, Ina Young. So it was, I for many years seen that name on the stone, and suddenly there is Ina. Poor wee thing, but it's such a lovely picture. Their next child, Sarah Ann, and her husband, Ed Turnbull. And they actually went to Winnipeg and settled in the West. And I actually never returned. And that was a very common thing. As the West was opening, so many families had their family members go there, because of course, there wasn't any further land and opportunity for them in Eastern Ontario. Another son, Samuel J. Young, and that's all I know about him. You can look up his grave, but in Calgary, but you can see that they commemorated him in Russell. Next, Adam Young, and he died in Ottawa and is commemorated in Russell. You can see what a big family this was. In fact, the family was 9 boys and 4 girls, the original Young family. Albert Emerson, and he ended up in Vancouver. He went, of course, first to Alberta and then to Vancouver. Next picture. And there he is again in this wonderful fur coat and hat. And these pictures were, they're on heavy cards. They were taken by a photographer, as you can tell, and they were sort of just sent home to Russell and kept in a glass case, you might say forever. And so it's just so interesting to see how they kept in touch with their family, having these pictures taken and sending them home. But I always liked this one because I always thought this guy had some whimsy. Susan Young. Now she is it's interesting. In her mother's will, she was a spinster, unmarried in 1900, and was told that she was to live with her brother, whose name was Godfrey. But Godfrey died, and we'll get to that. And she moved to Canton, Ohio, and became a nurse there, and served for a while in World War I, and is buried in Canton. But she did visit home quite often, and there are a number of pictures of her back in Russell. This is a card, one of those interesting sort of cards. It's not a picture, obviously, but it was one of the cards that were sent around as kind of memorials of people who had died. So this was in the glass case in Russell, except that the date is wrong. It should be 1893. But you'll see there that he died at 23. And, dying at a younger age was not unusual. In fact, many members of the family actually did die at a fairly young age. It was sort of, and that happened, of course, in our family on this side of the side too. Now, this is William R. Godfrey Young, born in 1869. He was born the year that his brother William Robert died. So what his parents did is they had another boy, and they carried the name on, but they added Godfrey. And we have a Godfrey on this side in Hazeldean, and they were named actually, I think, because the Anglican priest who baptized them was named James Godfrey, and it wasn't uncommon to borrow a name and use it like that. So the Godfrey name was kept by both sides of the family. But what's interesting about this picture is that he is standing with William R. Petrie. And some of you may remember that there was a famous store in Russell called the Petrie and McEwen store. William Petrie was born about 1846, so he's considerably older than Godfrey Young. And he was the reeve of the Township in the 1880s for a few years, and he was a postmaster till about 1912. Why he's in this picture, we do not know, but it's interesting to see another figure from Russell history in this photo. These are other members of the family. Well, you see Russell Young again, buried in Winnipeg, age 23. William R. Godfrey, who we just saw, who died at 31 in 1902, and his sister Florence, wife of Russell Craig, who died in 1903. Because it's interesting, as I said a minute ago, to see that Godfrey, after Susan was told to go and live with her brother Godfrey, but Godfrey died, and Susan decided she was going to strike out on her own and become a nurse. So an interesting kind of snapshot of life in Russell in those days. Now, these are the two of the daughters of Thomas Colbert Young. So these are of memory to people, of course, in Russell, because they, as you can see, they lived until 1990 and 1969. Just a moment till I get my notes here. Mabel was a school teacher. In fact, I saw a picture of her on the Russell Historical Society Facebook page the other night, who married Charles Eccles McCaffrey, and he died in 1938. So then she married Homer McEwen, and then Elvira married George Irwin McCaffrey, who lived 1893 to 1958. And she was the deputy land registrar and the organist at St. Mary's Church. Next. This picture is, of course, commemorates Russell Young, who was on the far right. He's a brother of the two girls we just saw, a son of Thomas Cuthbert Young. And he is well known and was known far and wide for his participation in the military, in the army during the First World War. He was awarded the DCM, which is the Distinguished Conduct Medal. He belonged to the 73rd Battalion of Canadian Infantry. And what is the DCM? I was amazed to read that it is an extremely high level award. It is the highest award that can be given to an NCO or a warrant officer. And the only medal higher is the Victoria Cross. So he was cited, it's for gallantry in action. So there's probably a lot of stories behind Russell Young and his war exploits. This is his wedding to Phyllis Federley in 1921 and June 2nd. And you'll see Thomas C. Young on the far left, and then his wife sort of in the middle, right behind. Okay. Russell Young and Phyllis Federley, I should have mentioned. Now we come to Russell and his family. George on the left. Their dates are on the screen, so I won't read them to you. Susan, who has come back for a visit from Canton, Ohio. Russell in the middle in his uniform. Muriel, and of course Russell's brother Edgar. Now, this is an interesting kind of mixture. These are the daughters of John Young, Mabel, and Evelyn. And Florence is from Mabel is from Thomas's family, but Evelyn and Florence are from John's family. Evelyn was born in 1904 and died in 1988, and her married name was Bacon. And her sister Florence was born 1900 and died in 1985 in Albany, New York, and her married name was Fusco. These are, you might say, kind of parts of the family that went a long way. And but in this picture, it's really nice to see that their aunt Susan has come home for another visit. Now we're going back to Clough-Jordan. Here is a picture I took myself of, might say, the road sign outside Clough-Jordan. And if we go to the next slide, this is rather interesting because in 2018, the government of Ireland dedicated this plaque, or at least the people of Clough-Jordan dedicated this plaque in honor of the Talbot settlers who had left exactly 200 years before. And the Canadian ambassador to Ireland attended this event. And this is quite an interesting thing because the names of the various settlers are on there. So if you ever end up in Clough-Jordan, you can find this right on the main street. The Anglican church is up behind there, and you can find Robert and Sarah Young right on that sign. So now this is a picture of the sign, and again, the detail is hard to read, but on the left, or I should say on the bottom, are the names of all the passengers on the Brunswick. And when there is also another similar sign or memorial, which has been placed in Fanshawe Pioneer Village in London, Ontario, was just put there last August. And I attended the dedication, as you might say, from the other side. They were the London group and we were the Goulbourn group. And so it was a bit of a reunion for me to go down and encounter many of these people, especially because there are still connections and relationships between these families.
Okay.
There we go.
I think that's your last slide.
Yes.
So I'm just going
So-
to go. Did you want to say something else, Roger?
Well, no, I'm just going to say if there, you could probably ask as well. I wonder if there were any comments or questions.
So you'll have to unmute to ask the question.
Yeah, Roger? Roger, can you hear me?
Yes,
Margaret?
yes.
Yeah, so you, the old Young family home that was taken over by the Moffats at the end of the Forest Road there, it did burn down. And then just one, and the house that's still standing, that replaced it.
Okay,
And it burned down apparently in the Depression times,
Okay.
Depression years, yeah.
yeah. Now, what I find interesting is that you mentioned that the Moffats took it over. Is that
Mhm.
right? But
Yeah.
your mother being a Young,
Yeah.
she sort of went back home.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, another thing I wanted to mention about that, the new house wasn't built on the old foundation, because I remember as a kid growing up there, the old foundation, it was just a bit north of the house that was built to replace it. And I remember it was still just like an old, a bit of the cellar was
Right.
there. Yeah. So it was built just a little bit south of the old home.
Someone else have a question? It was certainly nice to see all the photos and what people were wearing back in the day, and most interesting. And Roger had several other photos that we had to cut in order to keep the timing down, but quite a long story to tell anyway. And does anyone else have any comments to say? Don McCaffrey, or
He's talking, but he's
you
not.
have to unmute yourself, Don.
I've just done, are we coming through now?
Yes, yep.
Okay, 2 comments. First, going back before 1840, Roger, the Youngs were, according to my grandmother, Mabel Young, were not called Young, but were called Young. And they were brought to Ireland in the misguided British attempt to Protestantize Ireland. And when
Yes.
they arrived there, they realized this was not going to work. So they aborted the Brunswick and came to Canada, where we are much more tolerant religiously. My second comment, do you know anything about this?
Well, I do know that the Youngs, as well as many of the other Protestant families in Tipperary, wanted to leave. They were, I mean, the English did plant a lot of Protestant families in Tipperary, but there was a lot of friction, and certainly after the rebellion of 1798, their life was not very good. And of course, after the Napoleonic Wars, there was a downturn in the economy, and the Youngs and a number of the other Protestants wanted to leave. They didn't see a future for themselves there. So, and as you said, religious conflict was certainly part of that.
Well, the Youngs are not the Youngs, according to my grandmother. They're the Youngs, like the Austrian psychiatrist. And the second comment I make is about Russell. Again, my grandmother told me that Russell won his DCM by single-handedly taking out a German machine gun nest in the First World War. I don't know if this is public knowledge, but this is, and it may not be true, but this is the history that my grandmother gave me.
Well, that's very interesting. You can find these things out. In fact, all the World War I records of all the soldiers have been declassified and put on the website for the Library and Archives of Canada. So you can go through them, and probably that information would be there because he would have been mentioned in dispatches and so on. I didn't do that because frankly, it was an awful lot of paper to go through. So, but I think you can find that information out.
Roger, I'm retired and I still don't have the time to do such a thing.
Yes. But I find it interesting that the DCM is mentioned on his gravestone in St. Mary's Cemetery. So it certainly mattered a lot to the family, and it mattered enough that they wanted that to be commemorated permanently.
Yes, well, my grandmother, his sister, was very proud.
Well, that's great to know. There was one other connection I was going to mention is that Robert Young Jr.'s older brother, whose name was John, lived in Hazeldean, and he was married to Elizabeth Corbett and had 4 children, but his wife died and he remarried a girl from Russell, and her name was Anna Wilson. Her mother was a York. So it's clear that, and in fact, at their wedding, the bridesmaid was Susan Young. So it's quite clear that the cousins of that time did visit each other and did go back and forth to the point where John Young developed a relationship with a girl from Russell and married her. And then they lived in Ottawa, but of course, eventually he died and she moved west. But so there, I keep finding these little hints of connections. I've been asked, did I know there were any Youngs in Russell? I did not know. We thought we were the only ones. And so it's nice to find this lost colony of Youngs. But it's partly because certainly once you get into the late 19th and early 20th century, apparently I've read a comment that said about, communication or contact lasts about 3 generations, and then it seemed to have been dropped. I think the reason why my Aunt Etta had met Mabel and Elvira is because she met them at an Anglican church women event in Ottawa, probably somewhere in the 60s or even the 50s. So that was one of the few connections that probably remained.
Well, just watching the time as it's moving forward. Is there one more question or comment? Roger, I want to thank you very much on behalf of the Historical Society and our members. I think it was 2 years ago you offered to give this presentation, and Sue was going in for an operation, and she was hoping it would be postponed, and then COVID came and it got postponed, and just picking it up now. So I'm so glad that you were able to present it, and this has been a great way. People don't have to travel that long distance between Hazeldean and Russell, and so thanks very much, Roger, for making that presentation and giving us those photos that I would like to add to the Young family file that's in our museum. I don't know if you know we had a Young family file, but we do, and so I will be adding that to their file, your file.
Well, I have actually more. I didn't put them all out. In fact, as you know, we couldn't use all of the ones I had.
Yeah.
So I'll make sure that you get all of them. I don't want to take any more of your time because I know you have a meeting coming up, but just to say that there are still more pictures that did not have names on them that are unidentified. So I wouldn't mind at some point sending those to you as well, and maybe someone can identify them.
Now, the thing we haven't mentioned is that you have a book. You wrote a book about this. And so that I think I have a PDF copy of that book. So we will put that in the file as well.
Well, why don't I have one printed for you and drop it out to you, and you can have a hard copy.
That would be wonderful. We would love to have that in our museum.
Okay, well, consider that done. It gives me an excuse to go out to Russell, and I can drop in on Sue and, see what's happening in Russell, which seems to change every time I go.
Yeah, it's certainly changed. So thanks again, and I'm going to pass the meeting over to Lois. James.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Young and Chair and Harry for chairing that part. And by the way, you don't need an excuse to come to Russell. You're welcome anytime.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And we really appreciate the presentation. And yeah, with 16 people, I think we had on the call tonight. That's great. And a couple more that couldn't get on because of the phone, because they were going to phone in. But Harry has recorded it, so they'll be able to listen to it that way. Anyway, again, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Look out,